Hey everybody, this video is called Those Gibeonites, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Joshua, looking at the 9th chapter, where we're going to look at how the Gibeonites deceive Israel here. So in Joshua chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, it says, "And it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland, and in all the coasts of the great sea, toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel in one accord." So we see in the opening of the chapter that southern kings are gathering in unity together against Israel. And in reality, they should have feared Israel when they heard how Israel's God delivered Jericho to Israel. And they heard how the Lord gave victory to Israel over Ai. In verse 3 through 6 it says, "But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done at Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, and said to him, to the men of Israel, We have come from a far country, now therefore make a covenant with us." So Gibeon, it was northwest of Jerusalem, and it was about 7 miles from Ai. And it was a strong city that was full of capable fighting men. It would not be something easy for Israel to take on in their own human power. In the Gibeonites, we see here that they try to deceive Israel into making a peace treaty with them. And in Exodus 23, verse 23-24, it prohibited Israel to make peace with any of the tribes of Canaan. And notice their tactics. So we see that the Gibeonites were craftily, meaning clever. And number 2, they misrepresented themselves by pretending to be ambassadors. And number 3, they gave false evidence of their deception with the old sacks, the wineskins, old and patched sandals, and dry and moldy bread. And then the 4th thing is they lied. They lied saying that they were coming from a country when they lied saying they were coming from a far country when they obviously had not. And in verse 7 through 13 it says, "Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, Perhaps you dwell among us? So how can we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, We are your servants. And Joshua said to them, Who are you and where do you come from? And they said to him, From a very far country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, Take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, We are your servants, now therefore make a covenant with us. This bread of ours we took hot for our provision from the houses on the day we departed to come to you. But now look, it is dry and moldy. And these wineskins, which were filled with new, and see, they are torn. And those garments and our sandals have become old because of the very long journey." So the Gibeonites, they are very crafty because they show admiration and honor to the God of Israel here. In verse 14-15 it says, "Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask the counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them." So we see that the Gibeonites' plot was a success against Israel. And Israel, they failed spiritually as they were not vigilant. They did not pray about what was happening. They were making decisions before they prayed. So they never acted on God's counsel. And Israel, goes on to make peace with them, despite God instructing them to eliminate the people of the cities back in the land in Deuteronomy 7, verse 1 and 2. And God permitted peace with cities outside, as stated in Deuteronomy 11 through 15. In verse 16 through 20, says, "And it happened at the end of the 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were the neighbors who dwelt near them. Then the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kirjath Jearim. But the children of Israel did not attack them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. And all the congregation complained against the rulers. Then all the rulers said to the congregation, 'We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. Now therefore, we may not touch them. This we will do to them. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath we had swore to them.'" So the people of Israel, they go on to complain against the rulers who knew they had to do right and that they had to honor the vow that they just made. And even though it was a bad oath, we recall in the law of Moses that oath keeping is very important to God. And it was the right thing for the rulers to do, and they weren't to give in to the public pressure of voiding the oath and making themselves out to be, not filled with integrity and liars. And later in 2 Samuel 21, verse 1 through 9, it shows that King Saul, he broke the vow to the Gibeonites. And then what happens is his sin brought famine upon Israel in the days of David. In verse 21 through 27, to wrap up the chapter here, it says, "And the ruler said to them, 'Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them.' Then Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, 'Why have you deceived us, saying, We are very far from you, when you dwell near us? Now therefore you are cursed, and none of you shall be free from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God.' So they answered Joshua and said, 'Because your servants were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Therefore, we were very much afraid of our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And now here we are in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us.' And he did to them and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, so that they did not kill them. And that day Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord in the place which he would choose, even to this day." So while honoring the pledge of peace with the Gibeonites, Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers because of what they committed with the deception. And Gibeon was a part of Benjamin's land area later in Joshua 18:25. And later, Joshua co-signed Gibeon as one of the Levites' towns in chapter 21, verse 17. And then even in Nehemiah, you're going to find Nehemiah chapter 3 that some Gibeonites were working on the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem. And the Gibeonites did not seem to complain to become slaves under Israel, but they were rather happy to be incorporated within Israel. And the Gibeonites, they find salvation, much like Rahab found salvation back in Joshua chapter 2. And they were willing to forsake their former associations. They were willing to forsake their former life and to be accounted among God's people. So to wrap up with this, we looked at two different strategies of attack against Israel. We see the southern kings gathering in unity together against Israel. And then we see that the Gibeonites, they approached Joshua and Israel in another way. And the Gibeonites, they explain a fabricated story to Joshua and the leaders of Israel. And then we see that Joshua and the leaders of Israel, they fall into the deception of the Gibeonites. And when we don't seek God's counsel, we are going to make poor life decisions ourselves. And that's when we fall into the trouble and sin. And we see the deception of the Gibeonites uncovered and dealt with as Joshua and the leaders discover that they had been deceived. And I don't know about you, but have you ever been in a life situation where you didn't see it at the time that you were deceived over something and the truth came out later on, or it clicked to you that something wasn't right? You know, it reminds me of used car salesmen. They should be called Gibeonites, because a lot of the used car shops that are small, independent, I'm not saying all, but a lot of them are a bunch of crooks. And I've been through a lemon law case of one that was trying to conceal issues. But we saw that the chapter, it ends with a glorious punishment for the Gibeonites as Joshua goes on to make them slaves. And it kind of gives me a picture when I read this passage of salvation, like Rahab and us. So what about them after this chapter? Well, the Gibeonites, you're going to hear about them a few more times throughout the Bible. In 1 Chronicles 16, verse 39 through 40, they became a priestly city, and even the Ark of the Covenant stayed at Gibeon often in the days of King Solomon and King David. And in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 4, at least one of David's mighty men was a Gibeonite. And in 1 Kings 3:4, God spoke to Solomon at Gibeon. And this chapter to me is like a picture of our salvation, that God takes us in, God adopts us into his family. Even though we were ungodly, God adopts us in, and we go from being slaves of our sin, our culture, to slaves of Christ. And God does great things with sinners who come to him humbly in humility. And that's going to wrap up this video, as next we'll be looking at chapter 10, where the southern kings are conquered. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.